With me, I've got Adele Ford and Annette Senior, the Directors of Record Keeping Innovation. And from Data ESG, we've got Carolina Donores, she's our ESG specialist, and Roger Mills, he's our Manager of Sustainability and Social Impact Strategy. So I'm based here in Canberra, and I'm the Business Development Manager for Datacom IT. So we work a lot with records managers, a lot of Brimper members, but also our sister company, Data ESG, and we provide ESG consultancy services and reporting tools. And this was really the inspiration for today's event, to discuss the strategic role of records managers in Australia's ESG reporting. So today's webinar will be conversational and it will be interactive. So if you have your phones ready, when you see a QR code, just hold your phone up and it will allow you to vote on questions that we pose throughout the presentation. So we want you to get involved. Also, as Lisa said, please ask questions in the chat and we will get to those questions. Okay, so what is ESG? So ESG refers to the environmental, social and governance factors that investors measure when analysing a company's sustainability efforts. So, Carolina, over to you.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you all for being here. Actually, I'm really glad to be here and be part of this. Before we dive into the detailed discussion, I would like to set the stage with a short piece I've prepared for you guys today. So it highlights how records management, something that might seem operational or technical, it's actually a cornerstone of good governance and directly linked to ESG principles. This will help frame the conversation and show why records aren't just compliance tools, but essential proof of accountability and sustainability. So the piece is called Records Management as a Pillar of Good Governance, aligning with ESG principles. So how can we actually make both words work together? In today's landscape of increasing transparency, accountability, and social responsibility, ESG, which means environmental, social, and governance, has become more than a trending term. It's a powerful framework used by investors, regulators, and the broader public to assess how responsibly and ethically an organization operates. So while much of the focus often lands on the environmental and social pillars, covering topics like emissions reduction, community impact, or workforce well-being, the G for governance, it's where the structural integrity of ESG lives. So governance, it's about how decisions are made and how risks are managed, and ultimately how an organization holds itself accountable. This is exactly where records management becomes not just relevant, but absolutely essential. The connection between ESG and records management, it's often underestimated. But when we break it down, it becomes clear. Records are the foundation of good governance. They form the audit trail behind every single policy decision. So, for example, contract, disclosure, and performance report. Without reliable and well-managed records, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to demonstrate accountability, to meet compliance obligations, or validate ESG claims. In fact, I'll give you some stats to use. So according to a recent PwC survey, 78% of investors say they want companies to explain the governance mechanisms behind their ESG strategies. Not just report on the results, but how can companies do that without the supporting documents? Like, where is the evidence of how decisions were made, what methodologies we followed, and how risks were assessed? So these gaps in record keeping can quickly become reputational and regulatory risks. So consider, for example, a company that claims 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, right? So that's great headline, but where is the proof? So are the energy consumption records complete, time-stamped, or verifiable? Is the data traceable back to source? Are any changes to methodologies documented in a constant way? So if these records are fragmented across the spreadsheets and old email chains or unstructured folders with no audit trail, the ESG story quickly loses credibility. So what's more? So let's think, good records management also contributes to the environmental and social pillars. For example, robust AGR records support diversity and inclusion reporting. So very important. So ethical sourcing can be traced through procurement documentation, for example. Environmental data feeds into sustainability and emissions reporting. When records are centralized, structured, and actually governed properly, they don't just fulfill compliance obligations, they become strategic tools for ESG performance. So, as the World Economic Forum has noted, one of the greatest risks that we now face in our world is the erosion of trust through misinformation. In this context, strong records and information governance, it's no longer a back office function, it's a pillar of integrity. Records are not merely documents, they are tangible evidence of an organization value in action. So they demonstrate that governance commitments are not just stated, but consistently upheld through transparent and accountable practices. Thank you very much for being with me on this. So yeah, get back to John now.
Okay. So this is the first of our polls. So if you want to get your phones up and scan the QR code. And the question is, who is familiar with ESG reporting? So yes or no. So you just get your phone, put the camera onto the QR code. It should pop up with the word Slido. There we go. Someone's voted. I'll give you all a chance to vote. Some yeses. Give you another few seconds to vote. Okay. So it looks like most people aren't familiar with ESG reporting, but we do have some people who do have some experience with ESG. That feels like it's settled now. Okay, so we'll move on and we'll revisit a similar question at the end. Hopefully by the end you'll feel more comfortable with the ESG reporting and all that goes with it. Still got someone else voting. All right, Roger, over to you with regards to the reporting.
Thank you so much, John. And this is probably a good time for me to lay out what mandatory sustainability reporting, otherwise known as climate-related disclosures, is. Basically, this came from legislation from the government and became law from January 1 this year in Australia. And what this means is that the following groups of companies or organizations meeting 2 or 3 criteria in this table have to report Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Now, I'm not assuming you know what Scope 1 and 2 emissions necessarily are. So Scope 1 emissions are direct greenhouse gas emissions that your organization produces, such as on-site emissions from the production process of a product or a service. Or there could be vehicle fuel combustion. We think of Scope 2 emissions. They're what we think of as indirect emissions, such as those caused by, lighting or heating or cooling your office through the generation of electricity. And there's a third one here, which is Scope 3 emissions, and they're from an organization's supply chain. It's really just Scope 1 and 2 that's being required in this first reporting period, but Scope 3 will then be followed in the following reporting periods as well. So they are very relevant as well. I should just say that I'm using the words companies and organisations interchangeably here because government business units are also required to report their emissions as part of the net zero in government operation strategy, which some of you may or may not know if you're working for government organisations. But essentially, Group 1 are really your large ASX major companies and their major emitters as well. And so 2 or 3 of these criteria must be 500 million in revenue or $1 billion in assets. Then we've got Group 2 that really should be on this already, planning for next year. They are organisations, mid-sized firms that have, let's say, a revenue of 200 million or 500 million in assets, or say 250 employees, any 2 of those. And then we've got our final Group 3, which have to report from July in 2027. Typically, your SMEs, your large not-for-profits with a turnover of 50 million revenue or 25 million in assets, or let's say 100 employees. And while there's still a year before this group has to report, anyone in this league must be starting to think about this already, because you must be starting to prepare your reports. This is where record keeping is so important. So no doubt most employees, most attendees here fall into one of these 3 categories and may already be aware that sustainability reporting is underway in their organisation, or may have already been called upon to provide records related to one or more of these emissions factors. But just finish by saying really the greenhouse gas emissions are the E of ESG, but they are in no means the only considerations for records managers, as we'll touch upon in this webinar. The S, or the social, and the G for the governance are critical components of record management as well. So maybe we can get an idea of who of our attendees here works for an organisation in one of these 3 groups. And John, maybe can bring up our second poll, and we can take our temperature on this one.
So same thing again, just point your camera at the QR code, click on the link on your screen, and let us know. I think this is going to change. So I'll give it sort of 10-15 seconds, give everyone a chance to vote. Oh, we've got some Group 2s now. This is nail-biting stuff.
On the edge of our seats. But it's good. It's a good indication that there's a cross-section of attendees here in each of these, working for each of these types of organisations.
It's a draw. So Annette and Adele win $50 each because
People are changing their minds.
Okay.
But what it speaks to is that those Group 2 and 3 organisations need to be thinking about preparing their sustainability reports.
Absolutely. Okay. So over to you, Carolina, for to pose the question around emissions audit.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Roger, as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Scope 2 emissions. I just picked one of the scopes, which Roger clarified really well. I want to put some scenarios out there for you guys, and then at the same time, just that you imagine in real world what it would be, and then at the same time, throw the questions to our specialist team. So let's start with some emissions data. Under ESG reporting frameworks like GRI, for those who don't know what GRI is, it's a global reporting initiative standard, right? So organizations are required to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. So Scope 2 emissions in particular are the indirect emissions from purchased electricity, just as Roger said, right? So to prove these numbers, companies need accurate and complete utility records. Things like electricity bills, meter data, and supplier invoices, for example. So now imagine the scenario. Imagine that we are preparing for an audit and realize that 2 months of invoices from like 2022 are missing. that gap could seriously undermine our like ESG report. So here's the question for our records team. How would our information governance framework make sure these gaps don't happen and that invoices are always retrievable when needed?
Thanks, Carolina. I just want to say thank you, Carolina, John, and Roger. Record Keeping Innovation, Adele, Annette, and myself are very happy to be part of this webinar. And I also want to thank Carolina for very nicely highlighting at the beginning of the webinar the role of records in performance, integrity, accountability, and transparency, which, as we all know, is really important. And as we've seen in recent times, many audits and royal commissions make mention of poor record keeping practices, which in some cases have had some significant impacts on communities and individuals. So the G part of it is as a pillar is so happy to hear Carolina call that out. But in regards, I guess the management of emissions data, one of the first things I think that is important also to raise in terms of the management of information and data assets across an organisation is having an information governance framework and providing that overarching unified approach to the management of those assets. Because, you know, with that sort of unified approach, you're getting the contribution of a range of business perspectives across many areas of the business, such as privacy, such as security, and information and records management. And I think this is really important to bring that, to have that approach in terms of how the data that's being collected and the data that's being managed within an organisation. And so, you know, on that, understanding where your data assets are held, what repositories, what business systems is the data being stored in? Are those business systems or repositories fit for purpose? Who needs access to that data and for what purpose? And I think all of those questions can be answered in terms of, you know, through data catalogues, information asset registers, whatever they may be called by different organisations. But there are means of understanding where your data is, being able to manage that data, manage the risks associated with that data, so you're not there, that you don't have incidents where there's a loss of data or breaches or whatever it might be. And another part of this also is being active in the management of that, for information and records managers to be active in the management of the organisation's data and information. It's our role to ensure that information is accessible, that it can be used for different purposes. It's not just for a single purpose. You know, invoices might be going into a finance management system, for example, but the ESG team need that data to be able to perform the role that they need to perform. So how can that be achieved, either through metadata and interoperability or whatever? The information and records management people with those skills around the management of the assets over time is really important, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, that you know, one of the things that we do is in our consultations is working with sustainability officers who are possibly implementing an emissions management solution, and very often needing exactly those records and ensuring that they're there, and that all the provenance of those records can be checked and verified as well before they go into the system. So it's a really important point there.
Yeah, and the emissions management system, if an organisation does happen to have one of those, is a key business system that would appear on your information asset register with the, you know, with the relevant sort of criteria applied to that system around ownership and the type of data that it's managing and the record keeping requirements around that. I guess it'd be interesting to know actually from our participants who does have an information asset register in which they're able to sort of monitor, you know, where their information assets are stored, who owns them, security needs, risk, etc.
I'm going to vote myself this time.
That's encouraging, 100%. This is good.
Yeah,
That's good.
Oh.
Well done.
Oh,
still encouraging, but maybe some work to be done. Yeah.
That's right. I think it is encouraging that we're getting over that 50% mark in terms of information asset registers. That's really encouraging because they are a fantastic management tool.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think the thing that keeps coming up for me is good records management fundamentals equals good ESG reporting. I think that's
Yes.
we're doing this.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Carolina, over to you for diversity and inclusion reporting.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Adele, as well. Really well clarified. Very interesting conversation. So the next scenario, we're going to talk about workplace diversity and inclusion. So under GRI 405, which each GRI has one number, this one particularly, Global Reporting Initiative Standard on Diversity and Equal Opportunity, the organizations must disclose the composition of their workforce and leadership by gender, age, and other relevant indicators. So they also need to report on pay equity, comparing salaries of men and women in similar roles, etc., etc. So that means AGR data isn't just internal anymore. So it becomes part of the sustainability reporting, but it's also sensitive personal information, so which requires privacy safeguards. So here's the question. When HR needs anonymized workforce data for diversity reporting, how do we make sure those records are accurate, privacy compliant, and easy to trace back to source?
Well, this is a bit of a big one, isn't it, Carolina? I think in terms of the data, collection of data, if it's consistent, if it's inconsistent, which can lead to poor results or the wrong result, how that data should be protected and the employees safeguarded, and also maybe there are concerns from some employees about, if the collection involves, provision of data from employees, that their concerns about that, about data sharing. So I think there's a couple of issues. There's the privacy impacts about that. There's the retention of data and how long it needs to be retained for, and because there are concerns around over retention of data, as we all know. But the bottom line is for the reporting to be good, then the data needs to be good. And so I think how that is collected, what's collected, where it's stored, and the data management processes around that all form part of ensuring that accurate records are created at the end of the day. And there is sort of our record keeping principles aren't, when I say data management processes, our record keeping principles aren't dissimilar to principles around management of from a data management perspective. So I think all of that combined is what's needed for the sound for the accurate records being created at the end of the day, and that the good quality data, the processes around collection, all of those things, understanding where the data's come from, and having all of that documented can only stand an organisation in good stead as a foundation because as we all know, there's AI tools. Organisations are discussing implementing AI tools to do a lot of things, and we just need that good data to be able to implement tools like that, particularly in areas where there's personal data being captured and managed. And plus also on that, I guess from a de-identified perspective, making sure you've got the tools in place to be able to do that properly and effectively. Not that I know too much about that, though, I have to say.
I know from experience that I've digitized a lot of personnel records over the years, and being able to do redaction properly, not just on the image, but the text file that sits behind an image on a PDF file or anything that's got OCR on it, it's super important. All right, phones at the ready. There's another poll coming here. So, has anybody met their sustainability officer. This assumes you do have a sustainability officer. Maybe you are the sustainability officer and the records manager. It's entirely possible. Don't have one. Okay. Settling down. A couple of seconds. All right. So most people don't yet have one.
Yeah, because it's those large organizations that have implemented sustainability roles, chief sustainability officers, for instance. And the smaller organizations, mid-sized firms, are often delegating that type of work to another employee who's already wearing another hat. So that's possibly through additional training or something like that.
Okay. So on to the next one. Supplier ESG compliance checks. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you all again. Let's move now into supply chains, right? So a tier 1 supplier, for example, is a direct vendor. The company or organization buys goods or services from directly. So for ESG compliance, organizations often need to demonstrate that these suppliers meet ethical and environmental standards. Very important. So for example, under Australia's Modern Slavery Act, companies must show due diligence in ensuring their suppliers are not involved in any exploitative practices. Now imagine the scenario where the procurement is asked to show evidence that every tier 1 supplier signed a modern slavery compliance statement last year. Some are saved under vague file names, others are scanned PDFs with no date, and one is misfiled under the wrong supplier, for example. That would be like a nightmare to prove an audit, right? So here's the question. How does our records management process ensure supplier compliance, like supplier compliance statements, ensure that they are easy to find, to validate, and to audit?
I think, Carolina, there's some questions around, in this particular one, around, processes. For example, in making sure that there's quality control processes in place when scanning documentation, for example, and ensuring that everything is legible and as it should be. In regards the wrong filing of things, and Katrina made a good point in the chat from one of our earlier conversations about training and awareness. And I think there's a couple of things, that training and awareness and understanding about what needs to be, where things need to be stored, how they need to be saved, all of those sorts of things. It's a really important piece of work from a records management, information management perspective, that staff understand what their obligations and responsibilities are. But also, how can we then make things a little bit easier? So how can we enable the automated capture of metadata, for example, in some of the systems that people are working to enable some tagging, which will enhance and searchability and findability of records and retrieval of information, and give some more context around the records themselves by using metadata in ways to enhance that sort of finding of the information that you're after. So it is about records managers, information managers working with business teams to understand the information that they have, to understand what they want from the information and how they need to retrieve that, understanding their processes. So there's it's I guess a many-faceted thing in a way, in terms of the records managers working with the business and engaging with businesses to help them with their record keeping obligations, how the systems and tools can help them with their record keeping obligations in a streamlined and possibly automated way. Because as we know, not everyone wants to tag things, but that's also a change and awareness approach as well as part of that. And then the other side of that is then corporate standards around naming conventions and which metadata is a part of that as well. And you can't always, there are always, errors. Humans make errors, that's for sure. But I think there are plenty of opportunities to sort of mitigate that by using the tools and technologies and enhancement of processes.
Does anyone else on the panel have any more comments on that, or shall we move on to the next? Okay. So, environmental data methodology change. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, John. So let's continue here. So by the point now, you guys realize that ESG reporting isn't just about raw data. So it's about the methodologies. So for example, if a company changes the way it calculates water consumption halfway through the year, that change has to be documented. Auditors will want to see both the old method and the new one, plus the rationale for the change. So here's the scenario again. 6 months later, an external auditor asks us to show how water usage was calculated before and after the change. How do our information governance practices ensure we can retrieve both versions clearly, with dates and version history intact?
It is very critical to have the evidence of how something was done and why it was done and why it changed. And if that's not the case, there can be serious consequences for organisations. And I think this is where the systems come into play here to be able to support the capture of metadata, process metadata around the records in audit logs, so that you can see what's been done, by whom, when, how, what version it was, whether that's a significant version or not. Some of this could be documented in a workflow, for example, which becomes a record of the actions and the approvals taken. And so these things are pretty critical in supporting the record keeping around the management of to understand the changes in methodologies over time, and also how long that needs to be retained for as well, in terms of showing that history of change. And that's important to meet your business and regulatory requirements, but also your community obligations, because the topics that we're talking about in terms of ESG are pretty front and centre in the media these days, from at all sorts of levels. So it's important that the good record keeping is built in around all of this. And thinking about, if there's going to be a business system, what functionality is needed in a emissions management system, Roger, isn't it? What functionality is needed in an emissions management system? What metadata do we need to capture? What information management, records management functionality is needed? So those, working in government areas would be familiar with business systems assessment frameworks and other things like that to look at what functionality might be needed based on the value and risk of the data and information that's going to be held in that system.
I mean, just talking about the emissions management solution there, Adele, many organizations, particularly in mid-sized companies, are also going for B Corp certification. And as part of that B Corp certification, and perhaps Carolyn can speak a little bit more to this because she does this for data ESG as part of our consultancies. But that's where any change to methodology in the collection or the analysis of data is really important to log and track and to be able to prove as part of that B Corp certification process. So, Carolyn, do you have anything else to comment? You've actually on the ground experience with this.
Oh, yes, for sure. So B Corp is more about also tailoring for each organization what they need, but also targeting exactly the steps that they need to take to get the certification going, right? So that's what I could add as well to that. So it is another layer that will ensure the organization is ready to get the certification at the same time to comply with the frameworks.
Yeah. I think also creeping about drinking river water will make your hair fall out. I think that slide.
I'll just preface that by saying I've not been drinking any river water here, but
all right. That's it. Governance in decision making, Carolina.
Thank you all again. So let's talk about governance, right? So how it drives decision making. And it's the central part of ESG, actually, is the G of ESG, right? So this means not just making good decisions, but also being able to prove how those decisions were made. So let's say the board decided last year to invest in a carbon offset project. Today, the media outlets question the legitimacy of those offsets, for example. So the ESG team needs to show the meeting minutes, the research considered, and the due diligence process. So it's backed by science, let's say, right? So here's the question. How does records management ensure we can retrieve the full decision-making trail, not just the outcome, but the supporting evidence?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here, because in our experience with organisations, decisions made at the board level are generally pretty well documented, and records are very well maintained with minutes and decision registers and other associated bits and pieces. And as we know, those board records are permanent records. Where we see some conflict, though, is and not in every single organisation, so may not, and some of you on our webinar might be familiar with this particular conflict, where a team might be, developing the report to go to the board. They've got all their supporting data. It goes up the line to Secretariat, and there might be a change made to that report. And sometimes that's not always communicated back to the team terribly well. Sometimes it is. So I think what's important is that those supporting documents that are created by the ESG team as part of supporting evidence for whatever they're presenting to the board, in this case the carbon offset project, decisions around that are really important to understand how they got from point A to point B in their decision making processes, and the due diligence processes that went around supporting that, just those recommendations and decisions. So that's really critical. So the information, having that framework, supporting that more collaborative approach, and understanding your organisation and understanding how an organisation works, I think is really important in sort of mitigating any risk that might flow from what the ESG team may have, to if there's possibly been a change in something made at a higher level. And I don't, so I think that's that framework just enables a more sort of a collaborative approach to the record keeping aspects of an organisation, and the ability to engage with different parts of the business and work with them on processes, and ensuring that those records that support decisions are available with the supporting research, with any other supporting documentation, meeting minutes made by the team themselves as well, in terms of how they came to their decisions. So I think it's a bit of a sort of a two-pronged approach, I guess, because the board records are generally pretty well looked after. So it's working with those business teams.
Yeah, I was going to say also, Adele, I think it's important that staff are aware of the importance of those records that support the board records, because often staff are aware that board records are critical and they're important and we need to manage those, but sometimes they are perhaps not as concerned about how they got to that point, that methodology, the source information, and how we manage that source information. It is just as important, just as critical, to maintain that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And some of you in the webinar may have experiences with what that scenario that I just outlined, with changes being made further up the line, and then, oh God, that's not what I put in the first time round. Yes.
Okay. So, does your organisation have an information governance framework to help establish good ESG reporting practices? So, does your organisation have an information governance framework to help establish good ESG reporting practices? So we've got mostly no's at the moment. Yeah, I think it's a pretty strong no.
Surprisingly, that there's so few people with an information governance framework. That surprises me.
Well, do you think they might have an information governance framework, but not one that supports good ESG reporting practices? Maybe it has. Maybe people don't. Depends how you take the question.
Yeah.
Right?
Interesting results.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, community impact project evaluation. Carolina, lucky last.
Thank you, John. Yes, I'm also impressed by the way that people have governance frameworks in place, even though it's already positive. So finally, so let's look at social impact. Also very important. So under GRI 413, now we have 413, the organizations are asked to report on their engagement with local communities, right? So that often means proving the details of programs like surveys, attendance records, outcomes, like feedback. But in practice, these records are often always scattered across like team folders, emails, spreadsheets, etc. So imagine a community program we run in 2023, let's say. Now the ESG team needs all the attendance sheets and feedback forms for reporting, etc., etc. If those records are scattered, the task becomes slow or unreliable. So here's the question. How could our records management processes make this information more centralized and ready for reporting?
So, I don't know, we go into many organisations and there's, just as you described, Carolina, there is stuff everywhere in, all sorts of squirreled away in all sorts of places. And that scenario is, I think, a perfect guinea pig or pilot or whatever you would like to call it for, if you're working in SharePoint, for example, setting up a project site, something that's got a start and a finish date. The information and records managers working with that particular team on how that site might look, with a sort of a logical structure and design, using as much metadata as possible so that all of the records around that program and everything that went on with that is in one place and not, over with the marketing team or then the whatever other team, they've got their own set of stuff going on. And, sometimes always a bit unsure what the sort of authoritative version of something might be because it's in several different locations. So I think, using the collaborative tools that are available to us now makes it's something like this, the management of the records around something like this very, really easy in a way and really good, because those who need access to it can have access to it. Access can be taken away when the project is finished. The records and information managers can be involved in the establishment of this and understand the types of stuff that's being collected, understand the retention requirements on that, the key records that are coming out of the process, understand privacy implications and work on the collection of data, for example, if there's surveys going on and there's other activities going on where personal data is being collected. So I think it can work very well if the site or the project area is designed to meet the needs of that particular project with the appropriate management controls around the content, so that it's, and then at the end of the project, as it's wrapped up, it then you know, decisions can be made about who still needs access to it. For example, other permissions can be taken away. There may be external people needing access to this particular one as well. That can be at the start. How that should be managed can be discussed. Yeah, I think it's a good example for a nicely structured sort of way of managing information in collaborative environments for those types of records.
And that's particularly the case for external evaluation of projects as well, where you just highlighted that there, Adele. And many companies and organizations are pivoting toward UN sustainability goals. And there is a real requirement there. I'm thinking here for the sustainability cities and communities, which is goal 11. And there's some quite stringent project evaluation to be able to claim that particular sustainability goal. And so an external evaluator coming in would require those types of well-kept records in that case as well.
And I think, you know, I don't know whether with any third parties that might be involved in a project such as a social program that has some community involvement, if there's you know, third parties who are also producing records on behalf of the organisation, so understanding that they need to understand what their obligations are and who owns those records and what needs to happen to those at the end of the day. Either they're, you know, managing them in their own environments, potentially they're sharing them via some other collaborative mechanism. So there's that's a key part of it as well. What happens to the data when they're finished, and the records that they've created if they're not already in the organisation's environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you all very much for that. One final poll just to take the temperature of how everyone feels now with regards to the ESG reporting. So who feels like they know a bit more about ESG reporting and why good records management is important? Well, this is reassuring.
It is reassuring. I think that's a job well done,
so
team.
far, not sure.
Oh, yeah.
I dwell too long on this one. Not sure. Well, if you're not sure, I think that's actually important that that you've come along today, and that, you know, feel free to reach out to us.
And there's some resources there, John, I know you're about to talk about as well, that
That's right.
anyone who's not sure after this can have a read of and explore further. Okay.
So these are all of our contact details and some additional resources. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Datacom IT and Data ESG, we work very closely with record keeping innovation and collaborate with these guys. And we really think it's a valuable opportunity for RIMPA members to reach out, and we're very happy to help you and work together to bring our expertise and support, as well as the tools that we use to assist organisations of all different types and sizes with their ESG reporting, which is going to become more and more relevant to more and more people over the next few years. You can see all of our details on the screen. And if anybody else has got any more questions, now's the time to put them in the chat. We do have 10 minutes left. So yeah, if you've got any questions, ask them now. Otherwise, unless anyone else has got any other comments or closing statements they'd like to make.
Thank you, John, as well. And everyone, as you're asking any questions, you are reminded as well that we will make sure to send the survey out to everyone after the webinar. And we will also be sharing the recording and the presentations that will include the Slido results as well. And we will also send any upcoming webinars and all of the additional resource link that John is listing there So we will make sure to give you all of that. In case you come up with any questions after the webinar, please feel free to email it to me, and I'll make sure to email it back to the panel, and they will get back to you as well. So in case you have any of that, let us know. Thank you so much, John, Adele, Annette, Caroline, and Roger. Thank you so much for coming today. It was really, really great. And I hope everyone had a really great time as well. If you'd love to see more of this, please add that into the survey. And we can see if everyone had the time to come back again for another webinar later on. I don't think there are any questions listed so far. Otherwise, we are more than welcome to take them afterwards. And then besides that, thank you, everyone, and have a really great day.
Thanks all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, guys.
See you guys. Bye-bye.